Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today on today's program. Today we have a very special guest from Ohio State University, and the topic will be something that I think most of us enjoy from our childhood days. Actually, I still do it today, and that is comic books, comic strips. I think of La Cucaracha, Lalo Alcaraz, comes out on the Los Angeles Times. I still go to the comic strips. I still read all that. But as a kid, I was always reading comic books. It was just entertaining. But I never realized that I was actually reading. I was reading a book. And then as I grew older, I started picking up Mad Magazine, and there was Super Machos by Rios in Mexico. And there's certain comic strips that I started to follow. The Wizard of Id. I love The Wizard of Id. Oh my God, I can't, especially now with politics as it is. So I always thought comic books was a way for me to learn things, and I took it that way. But then as I sort of went on and on doing more shows, I came across a story where it says, no, comic books are not important. They're useless. All this negativity about, using comic strips, comic books. So I started to do some investigation, and we did a show with Fernando Rodriguez, who does a comic book series, Aztec of the City. We did that show. That's available on YouTube. And as we kept doing the research, I realized, there is a professor out there, and we're going to interview him today, who has done research in this area, and he speaks directly to the topic. It says, what role does comic books impact our society, impact our culture, impact our communities? So I'm really happy to have him on board. And we have Frederick Aldama, Ph.D. Again, he's in the English department, Ohio State University. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Armando, for inviting me to speak here.
Okay, so now your area is not comic strips, comic books, but it is one of the areas, and I know you've written almost 20 books in very diverse topics. So we're going to focus on just that area. Could you tell us about the impact of comic strips, comic books, that it has on all of us as we're growing up?
Yeah, thanks, Armando, for that. I'll broaden this out in just a minute, but let me just say this. I was born in Mexico City, in DF, nací en el DF. When we moved, I was about 4 or 5 years old, to Califas, to California. And we were in a pretty rural part just outside of Sacramento. And my older brother, our first language, our maternal tongue was Spanish, but the schools we went to, and this was regular public school, but this was in the sort of dark days of the early 70s. They, if you spoke Spanish, you were speaking the dirty language. And if you spoke English with an accent, you were still speaking the dirty language. And I remember getting in trouble just for speaking my mother tongue, And I mention this because one way or the other, we face that all the time. Even those of us who are monolingual English speakers, we face the kind of prejudice in and around our communities and the way languages become racialized. I mention this because it's the experience of many of our Latino comic book creators, one way or the other. And today, you mentioned Fernando Rodriguez. There are so many others. There are so many other comic book creators that are Latino creating today. And I should add that there are now many, many Latinas also creating comics, and all kinds, superheroes, everyday comics, zines, all these kinds. It is a way of telling our stories. It is a way of overcoming obstacles, language obstacles, of overcoming racialized barriers that are put in front of us all the time, right? It's a way of sharing our stories, creating community through our visual and verbal narratives. It's a way of sharing the fact that I had this experience as a little boy, just like Fernando or others of our community have had these different experiences, so that we don't feel so alone. So just on that level, in terms of the creation of comics and our stories through comics, we are overcoming, but we're affirming, and we're creating the social glue that we need so much today. So that's a kind of a long answer, but I want to now take us back into a little autobiography here. When was my first foray, my first journey into the world where I could save my quarter and go to the Circle K or the 7-Eleven, and I could pick off the stand, the twirling stand in the 7-Eleven, my favorite comic book. I was, as a little boy, exercising my will and my taste already, right? You know, it's that great moment we have when we're little people, that we are independent of our parents. So comics was a moment for me in that regard. It was a moment of me feeling my agency, my power as a little Latino, right, in California, struggling in different ways. It was also a way for me to look at the pictures and start looking at the words together with the pictures, and really not only begin to increase my vocabulary and understanding, but also to step into the shoes of an X-Men or of a Batman or of, you know, any number of different characters that I love so much, and feel the freedom of doing things outside of my little community.
You know, you reminded me of a story. It's not super short, but I'll highlight it. I used to take my mother-in-law to visit her family in Sinaloa, near Culiacan. We were in a very rural area, and her father owned a little tiny store. And we were in an area where they usually harvested sugarcane for azúcar, sugar, and molasses. So it was very, very rural. People were very poorly educated. They were campesinos. Very nice people. Everybody was great. The reason I share the story is that there's one street that everybody go back and forth. And one of the things that he did is he put up a string along in front of his store that looked like you're going to hang clothing or something. But what he would do is he would put comic books, hang them with the clips on the top. And people, as they come back from work, they would stop and they would rent 5 cents, 5 pesitos, at that time it was like a penny. They would rent the comic strip, they'd sit down and they'd read it, they'd put it back, get another one, read it, put it back, and then they'd go home. They were in school. You know, they were in school for those 20 minutes, they were escaping, they were educating themselves. And I always remember that experience, that it was comic books, because it helped them to understand the concept. And you're highlighting that.
Yeah, I love that story. It also tells us a lot about the cultural differences of the US mainstream versus Mexico, and you know, even today on the subways and the buses, I see people reading comics, fotonovelas. It's you know, just as, you know, accepted as anything else.
Yeah.
Here we're still, and we have been, you know, traditionally, historically, kind of a little backward when it comes to acknowledging the importance of comics in our daily lives, right? So a lot of people, even when I teach comic books in my classes, and I always teach comic books no matter what kind of a class, you know, the students are a little bit taken aback that this isn't serious stuff. I'm in college, what are we doing here? And of course, after, you know, slowly guiding them through the art of the craft of narrative, the storytelling and the genius of it, they then kind of understand that they've missed out a lot. But there's a mainstream idea that somehow it's for kids, and that it's not the kind of knowledge, it's not the kind of learning space that you just talked about, or that you and I have both experienced in our lives.
Okay, help me clarify something. I'm starting to get a bit confused, and not by something you said, but you're making me think of other things. I pick up the New Yorker, okay, and it's got all these editorial pictures in there. Am I not reading a form of comic book?
Yeah, that's great. So those are usually one panel, say one panel strips or one panel comic, if you will. And because it's framed within the highbrow New Yorker, it's a kind of, it's acceptable, but it's there as relief from the serious. It serves the function of relief as something light and not the heavy, serious stuff that you're reading in the alphabetic, in the written text of the New Yorker. And that is the crucial difference, right? Now, if the New Yorker were reversing these two scenarios, then we could talk about how, in fact, comics are actually as revered and seen as important as the written text, but they're still not. So I'm really glad you brought that up, Armando, because that's a perfect example. The other example, of course, is that just in general, you see parents, you know, oh, it's okay when you're a child to read this stuff, or we read illustrated books to our children, illustrated where the pictures illustrate the story, but we you know, we don't sit down and do that with comic books. The comic book is the space for the child that will be grown, they will grow out of, and then suddenly be reading something like James Joyce's Ulysses, the serious stuff. But actually, you and I both know that we can learn now, not all comic books are made well, but we can say this, the ones that are made well and with real thought and creativity are the ones that can take us to those places where our minds blow up, our perception and our thinking and our feelings expand and explode, just like a good novel.
This is exciting. I'm just, all these ideas are coming to mind. Two things before I forget. Number one, so I'm stretching the idea here. Go with me a little bit, you know. So could I say that a engineering book is a comic book? Because everything is mostly graphs and designs and pictures. I'm stretching it here, but I'm really going with this for a moment. You know, so somebody could say, hey, that's a comic book, man. It's got nothing but pictures in it, you know, with a little bit of text in it. I don't know. I like that concept. The second one, please, as an academician, help me out on this one. Didn't somebody say that we never see words in our heads? Everything is pictures anyway? We translate the alphabet, no matter what the word is, we translate it into an image in our minds. So in fact, everything works in illustrations in our minds.
Yeah, so, you know, the first question, which is a really great question, the difference between something like, you know, the pictures you get when you open a box and you have to assemble a table, and a comic book is that, of course, one serves purely the function of instruction, telling you this goes here, this goes there, the next step is to do this. It's an algorithm, it's an instruction. The pictures completely serve, they're servile to the instruction, right? They want you to get it right so you don't bring this thing back to Target and get your money back. The difference with comic books is that the pictures, the visuals, the geometry, the word balloons, the type of font that's used, the ink, the colors, everything serves the function of propelling a story forward. A story. Okay, so we're not talking about instruction here, we're talking about developing character, arcs, we're talking about conflicts, we're talking about struggles that are overcome, we're talking about moments when characters, the light bulb goes off and something deeply changes in them. Visual serving the function of propelling forward, or what I've called in another of my books, it's the geometrizing of story. The geometrizing of story. I know that sounds clunky and academic, but the idea of these extraordinarily talented, gifted visual artists also knowing front and center that they are putting energy into propelling a story from A to Z. Does that make sense?
Oh my God, too much sense. Now I think I'm getting more insights thanks to you. I go to the Getty Museum here in Los Angeles. I'm looking at this big, huge picture, and someone's standing there and he says, well, this little piece up here tells me this story, and this tree over here tells me this story, and this little glass down here tells me a story, and the fact that the sword is pointing that way instead of that way is telling me a story. All of a sudden I'm starting to realize, wait a minute, am I looking at a comic strip that's sort of all bits and pieces all in one picture? And I don't know if we can answer that question today, but I'm really, really starting to think along these lines that comic strip is now something we can label and says it's over there. But if we start to get past the label and we sort of ferment the idea of illustrations telling us a story, then art, comic books, the series is it's all blended together. I'm starting to get this overlapping fusion in my head now. So
yeah, that's great.
So what
you're doing in the museum actually is what we call gap filling. Your imagination and all that goes into your imagination, your personal experiences, including your own reading of literature or going and seeing other art, or your experience as a Latino, they are all helping you create the glue, the thread from one object that you see in the painting to the next object, because we are built to make stories. You mentioned reading and how we sort of turn things into images. I would say that actually what we do constantly is everything from our senses, our sight, our sound, our taste, our touch. We narrativize, we turn this into story, because this is how our brain makes sense of that information. Just like dreaming, our dreams are fragments of images, of experiences, of emotions. And what our brain is doing is it's creating, it's gap filling, it's trying to make a coherent narrative out of it. And the talent and skill of someone like Fernando or others like Javier Hernandez or the Bros Hernandez or Laura Molina or Liz Mayorga or so many others that have dedicated their lives to developing the skills of visual and verbal, because of the word balloons and so on, storytelling, they know intuitively how to create energy as we move from one object or one panel to the next, as we build that narrative in our mind.
You're a mind blower. Now I'm thinking of Joseph Campbell with his stories of mythology and their importance in our society. So he's gone, unfortunately, but I think I found a new Joseph Campbell right in front of me here. So I'm just having a ball with all this. I have more questions, tons of questions. This is so exciting. But I do want our viewers to get access to more of your information. So do you have any contact information that our viewers can access to learn more about what you're doing and what you're sharing?
I do. So I'm the only Aldama at The Ohio State University. I am aldama.1 at osu.edu. So that's an easy one. And I welcome people to use that and to contact me, please, through that email. And of course, Facebook, social media, Frederick Luis Aldama at Facebook. Very simple, Frederick Luis Aldama. And this is also a nice little kind of, way to tie us back into the comics. I have a trade press series with OSU Press, an academic press, but it's a trade press series where I publish longer comic books, what some people might call graphic novels or graphic memoirs, under the imprint Latino Graphics at OSU Press. And so my Twitter handle is Latinx Graphics. That's my Twitter handle. So you can also follow me on Twitter there. But I mention this because we have so much talent. Our Latino community, there's so much talent there. As you and I both know, it's very, very difficult for our artists, our storytellers to break through and make a living through their storytelling and their art. There are a few. The Bros Hernandez, you know, they've been at this since the early 80s with Love and Rockets. They continue to create all sorts of amazing standalones and their own comic series with Fantagraphics, with some of the big East Coast publishers, Vertigo and so on. They are able to make a living. Most others have day jobs, you know, and sometimes not the most glorious and exciting. But in addition to that, many of them are still having problems with gatekeeping in the publishing industry. So you bring a story about an everyday, you know, struggle and overcoming of obstacles for a Latino character, and you take it to some of the mainstream publishers, and they aren't interested. They say it won't sell, we don't have readers, etc., even though you and I both know that's not true. At a certain point, I approached OSU Press here at The Ohio State University, and I said, let us launch a trade press series where we will provide a venue for high quality publishing of our Latina creators of comics, graphic novels, memoirs.
Wow.
And that's what it is. So Latino Graphics is the imprint at OSU Press. And I'm happy to say that the first book comes out this fall, and it's called The Diary of a Reluctant Dreamer. It is it's an incredible, it's really incredible, and it's told the story is from a wonderful friend, colleague, and creator, Alberto Ledesma, up at UC Berkeley. He works there in the graduate school, but he grew up here. He grew up in Califas, undocumented, made it through the system, went to Berkeley, got his Ph.D., is now making a difference for future generations of dreamers and undocumented students. And at the same time, he is a creator of a graphic memoir called The Diary of a Reluctant Dreamer that will be out with this series.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one. You know, for our viewers, we're talking to Dr. Aldama, UC Berkeley, and Stanford PhD. So, you know, he's not sort of inventing the stuff off the top of his head. I mean, there's a lot of research here from excellent institutions. I think, you know, something you mentioned before, it's starting to dawn on me that maybe what we're doing is we're working with an old premise that the entire market is only United States, but being that we are going global, whether people like it or not, it doesn't matter, it's going global. So whatever information comes out now can be distributed worldwide. And now a comic strip doesn't have to be in English or Spanish. It can be in Chinese for all we know. You know, Walt Disney has proven that. When I was a kid in Mexico, there was always a comic strip from Walt Disney. You know, Pato Donald, MacPato, Rico, you know, The Adventures of Mickey Mouse. And they were all in Spanish. There was no hesitation to translate them into other languages. And now we sort of are limiting ourselves to think, hey, if it's not in English in the United States, it has no market.
Yeah, no, you know, one of the extraordinary things I mean, we're living it right now in this moment, is the internet. And I know there are a lot of negative things about the internet. You know, I know that we've had this series of fake news and so on that's been very destructive. But of course, the internet has been also very positive for our Latinx, Latino, Latina creators, in that they've been able to crowdsource projects. They've been able to get their works out beyond the U.S. market. They've been able to get readers, globally of their work, etc. So this is a very emancipating moment where technology has finally come to a place where it can be used as a tool for dissemination, and where we no longer have to feel frustrated and shut down by folks, over in these East Coast high rises that are saying yes or no.
Now, as we've been doing the interview, and I'm just thrilled, I'm learning so much from you. There's a banner behind you. Could you tell us a little bit about the information of that banner?
Oh, yeah. So thanks, Armando, for asking. So as you know, I published a lot of scholarly books, and quite a few. In fact,
a whole mess of them. What do you mean a few?
A whole bunch
yeah,
of them.
Stacks of them.
So here I'll just I don't know if it can be seen, but one on one of our favorite directors, our most prolific directors, Robert Rodriguez.
I met Robert here in LA many years ago, walking around with his little tiny camera, just shooting everything and everyone. His parents thought he was crazy.
Yes, yeah. I love him. I love it. And I love that he gave me time at the end. Once he read the book, he invited me to his studios in Austin, and I did a very nice interview with him. Of course, we can't not have a book on Mexcine, Mexican movies, especially the ones that have been coming out in the last decade and a half that are really extraordinary movies, And as you know, Iñárritu and Cuarón are, they're the ones taking all the awards, at the academies and so on.
You're the one who raised this point, but people don't know this. When you're watching the new Star Trek movies, you're watching the producer, Roberto Orsi, and his family is from Mexico City.
Absolutely.
And he's writing here. So I know the family. But people don't know that they're watching a Mexican putting together a Star Trek movies, 2 or 3 of them already. So, I'm going along with your lines that people don't know that they're watching Mexicans at their work.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm really glad you brought that up. Just really quickly, I'll mention that on an MSNBC interview that I did, I wanted people to realize that even if we might not be in front of the camera, there are more of us now behind the camera. Mm-hmm. And there are more of us now even writing for the camera. Mm-hmm. And that's been making a difference. That has been making a difference. The creativity and the struggle that we come from as a people, informing the kind of direction and shape that stories are being given in the mainstream.
Taking all this from a different angle, there's so much here. Here we're seeing, within the last 5 years, a comic strip, Iron Man, or whatever, comic strips being transferred into movies and translating into billions of dollars. So maybe comic books is not as insane or sort of sidebar when you look at the amount of money they're generating through that medium being transferred now into movies.
Absolutely. There's something very deep, and getting back to your Joseph Campbell, there's something deep, universal, and archetypal about the comic books. There's something that the creators have touched, that have gone deep into and recreated in the comic book, in the comic strip, both mainstream, Latino, and the film industry have figured out that they actually don't have to do that much work because it's all right there in their backyard. Now, the one downside to this, I would say, is that there are creative decisions, and I'll give you a quick example, that continue to leave out and deliberately ignore Latinos in the film, the big budget films. One example, very glaring example, is in the Dark Knight series, Chris Nolan's Batman series. In the last of the trilogy, we had the character Bane, and he cast Tom Hardy, the British actor, was cast to play Bane. Now, if anybody knows where this comic book has come from, it's come from Nightfall, where Bane breaks the back of Batman, but Bane was grown in an Afro-Hispanic island, very identified as a Latino in that comic book. In the movie, instead of casting a Latino, they cast a British actor, which is pretty typical of the way the film industry is using this great repository of storytelling, of great imagination, of archetypes, of universals. But when they bring them into the big screen, the producers are still scared that having a Latino in front of the camera is going to mean drop in ticket sales.
How in the heck did we get from comic strips to movies? It's all blended together. I wish we had 20 hours to do this show straight through. We don't. That's the part
Armando,
I'm struggling with.
Let me mention one thing while we've got comics and film on the tip of our tongues here.
There you go.
To get back to the poster.
Yes.
After publishing a bunch of academic books, I decided I think I know a little bit about how narratives work, how stories work. And so I wrote my first book of fiction. Now, it is a book of fiction that is bilingual, written both in English and visual and Spanish. So it's all of the things that you and I love, and there are no walls. I refuse to put a blank page between the English and the Spanish. No walls in our world, right? No walls in our world. And the visuals.
Why not?
We don't want walls. We don't want walls between linguistic communities. We want the feel of us moving between the English and the Spanish, feeling the richness of the way we exist as Latinos in the U.S. We have also in the book what I'm calling Latinx flash fiction, Latinx or tweet fiction, Latinx tweet fiction. And there's an homage here to our friend Tito Monterroso and his very famous one-line flash fiction, "When he awoke, the dinosaur was still there." And where we go in our minds when we read a flash, something like this tweet fiction, and I'm going to read one very quick one here. Planning to teach, learning to read and write in order to teach to read and write, so they were killed. Learning to read and write in order to teach to read and write, so they were killed. In a way, this is maybe a way to kind of bring us round to our first topic of literacy. What does it mean for us, for our community, for those 43 in Mexico who work from very rural, poor Mexico, going to a colegio to learn, to teach, to read, to write those in their community, and they were disappeared. What does it mean for you and I to have chosen careers as teachers, going into our communities where we are not given the resources, like my mom, who gave her life, literally gave her life because she was teaching in an elementary school where they spray pesticides, giving our lives to bring literacy to the next generations.
Mm-hmm.
Risking it all in order to make a difference. And that's where comics can come in a powerful way. That's where you and I, in the dissemination of our knowledge, can come in our teaching practices, in the way that we want to open the doors for and provide the concepts and tools for our next generations.
You know, maybe the Greeks were right. They wrote the Iliads in picture form. And then the Catholic Church painted these portraits to give you a picture image of the story because people couldn't read. But the impact, we're still using it today. So how we turn something that we have used for centuries and said, oh no, if it's in picture form, it's of no good. Well, there goes the Egyptians and their hieroglyphics, and the Aztecas and the Mayans with their hieroglyphics. No. Pictures is bad. It has to be in words. I don't know. Is a letter a word, a picture? Boy, you got me so confused. I got so much to think about. I can't thank you enough. Could you please give us your contact information one more time?
Yeah, so Aldama at osu.edu, like I mentioned, I'm the only Aldama on you, and Frederick Luis Aldama on Facebook, and Latinx Graphics with 2 X's there, so Latinx Graphics as my Twitter handle.
We have to have you back on the show. There's just too much more information, and we're just barely touching the tip of the iceberg, and there's more to see here. And I think our next show need to focus more, which you started to do today, and we ran out of time, is the idea of the relationship that comic books can help increase literacy. And that part, I'd like to pursue that into the near future. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Closing statements, please.
My closing statements is, I know we all face challenges. We've got to keep working together to overcome those challenges. And we have to work together to lift the boat together.
Thank you very much. I'm just overwhelmed with all the great stuff that I learned. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been talking to Professor Frederick Luis Aldama. As you can see, he's just prolifically writing in many areas, but he's also giving us the time for us to understand comic strips, comic books, the importance that they can have to help literacy. As a matter of fact, yesterday, totally by accident, somebody told me that East Los Angeles, some individual on his own initiative is starting the Comic-Con of East Los Angeles. And I understand that several cities are starting to do this on their own, based on the success of the Comic-Con in San Diego. So, and then Stan Lee, I think, is even helping to promote people to become, to take their creativity. Can you imagine the idea if we take the Latino community, the kids that can draw, the kids that can write, the kids that can sort of know how to print, and put them together and come up with their own series of comic strips and comic books and share their own stories of their age, of their upbringing. What a powerful tool this would be, not only for them, but also for the readers as well. Oh my God, I want to continue. If you can sense my energy, and all of it comes from our discussion here with Professor Aldama here at Ohio State University. I wish you continued success. Please come back on the show. Please come back on the show. And let's continue the dialogue and bring some more of the individuals that you know and we should recognize for their talent and their work in the book industry.
Gracias, Armando.
Gracias a usted. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. I'm Armando F. Sanchez. I'm the CEO, Armando F. Sanchez producer. And you can find my productions and YouTube, almost the social, LinkedIn. You can find me, Armando F. Sanchez. I don't know, I'm losing track. There's more and more being added on every day. But the idea is contact me if you have any questions. Please feel free to contact Professor Aldama. He's very accessible. He really does want to share his information. I'm going to run off and buy his books as well. So we're going to support that idea. And again, we want to thank also Fernando Rodriguez. He couldn't be with us today, but he's on his comic strip, Azteca of the City. And you mentioned others, which we need to go back and find who they are and also highlight them as well. Literacy is at the bottom of this. Creativity is at the bottom of this. Growth and progress of our kids is all that. And anything that will help educate our kids and our future generations, we must access. Whatever the tool is, it's a viable tool. I think we can share the idea that we have to have all these tools working together, and also in the idea of film, which also Professor Aldama covers, and media. And where do you have time to sleep? I wish I had your energies. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being on our show. I'm Armando F. Sanchez. You can contact me at lsacnational@hotmail.com. Muchísimas gracias, Professor Aldama.